It's a great pleasure to be here again for the next instalment in Texts in the City. I was reading Richard III when Osama bin Laden died for one of these. And then my third baby was born when I was reading A Streetcar Named Desire. So Texts in the City is becoming... I'm kind of defining my 2011 by this series. And it is a series where we try to, I guess, celebrate and enjoy the VCE texts and not just treat them as the loathsome beasts that they are that are destroying all of your lives. So today we're going to do Streetcar Named Desire. I knew about this play only when I started reading it. My previous reference to it was A Streetcar Named Marge episode of The Simpsons. I don't know if anyone's seen that one. Called A Streetcar. Marge and several other women auditioned for Blanche Dubois, and the director immediately rejects Marge and the others, explaining that Blanche is supposed to be a delicate flower being trampled by an uncouth lout. However, as a dejected Marge calls home and takes Homer's dinner order, Llewellyn realises that she is perfect for the role. And it is a great episode, one of my favourites in the golden fourth series of The Simpsons. And it ends, it's a musical called O Streetcar, and it ends with the song Kindness of Strangers, a reference to Blanche's last line in the original play, as many of you will know already. The woman who's going to be talking about this play with me today is one of Australia's great playwrights. Her first hit play was called Hotel Sorrento, and it won the Australian Writers Guild Award and was made into a film directed by Richard Franklin. Now something of a classic itself, and does end up on Year 12 syllabuses, but not this year, so at least none of you hate our guest. She's had several other successes, many in fact: Falling from Grace, Scenes from a Separation, which was written with Andrew Bovell, Competitive Tenderness, Life After George, which is just a great play, Inheritance, The Glass Soldier and The Swimming Club. And her play, Two Brothers, was written at the height of the asylum seeker controversy in the Howard years. A terrific piece examining two brothers on either side of the political fence. She's won the Victorian and New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards, as well as the Sydney Myer Performing Arts Award, and she's even written for Sea Change. Please put your hands together for Hannie Rayson.
Thanks, Tony.
Now, Hannie, thank you very much for coming along. We always, I thought that given some of the people in the room, and there's a lot of you here, may not have read the play, I'm putting on my strict teacher's voice, you're going to do them the great service of telling them what happens, aren't you?
I thought that I'd start just by seeing if I can just pitch the play. I was saying to Tony in the room back there that often in rehearsal, when you're really in the thick of it, and you've the actors have been working away for some weeks, the director sometimes says, "Let me just tell you what happens," and at that moment there's a sort of fabulous clarifying effect. So I will make an attempt to just briefly tell you what happens in this play. The story is set in New Orleans, in Louisiana, in America's deep south. You've probably got that far. It's the reunion of two sisters. Blanche Dubois arrives with a trunk containing all her worldly possessions, so for a visit, but we assume that she's here for a while. And she arrives at a rather dilapidated place in the one up, one down, weatherboard apartment block, which is between the railway tracks and the river, on a street called Elysian Fields. She arrives on a tram, on a track of desire. The destination role on the tram, I'm thinking about this as I was arriving here on the tram, is desire, and you get off and you get on another tram for the cemeteries. So you're heading from desire to death. You take 6 blocks and then you arrive at Elysian Fields, and that's sort of like, I guess, a Greek mythic notion of the afterlife. And in fact, at the end of the play, Blanche arrives at the mental asylum. Blanche gets to the home of her sister, and she lives with her husband Stanley Kowalski, Blanche is a southern belle. She arrives in a white frilly outfit and very much a kind of emblem of gentility and aristocracy and sort of upper class values, I suppose, from old money, old world southern plantation roots, and finds this house, this husband, this neighbourhood not to her liking. From the word go, she's critical of her sister's circumstances, and she admits to her sister that they've lost Belle-Reve, the white-pillared plantation home where they grew up. Stanley suspects a rat, smells a rat, expects a swindle, but there is none. And then there's a poker game at the apartment. Stanley's drunk and irritated about having women in the room, and he throws the radio out the window, and then he beats up his wife, provoked by her calling him an animal. But to Blanche's dismay, well, they run upstairs to Eunice's apartment above, but to Blanche's dismay, Stella returns to him in the night, and by next morning she seems absolutely reconciled to her circumstances. And she says this marvellous thing: there are things that happen between a man and a woman in the dark that sort of make everything else seem unimportant. So we'll talk about the things that happen to men and women in the dark in a minute. Quite interesting. Blanche expounds on Stanley's bestial qualities. He's like an ape, and unfortunately Stanley is listening. And he knows that she's driving a wedge at that point. She's undermining his marriage, and he embarks on a path to destroy her. I love the sort of passionate kind of plot trajectories of this play. The stakes are high, and he's about to undermine her. He sets out to expose her. He's heard about her background in a hotel, that she's not such a la-di-da lady, that she's been having a bit of sexual activity in a hotel of ill repute, and she's got a bad reputation. Meanwhile, Blanche has latched onto Stanley's friend Mitch, who also works in the automotive spare parts factory, and despite the fact that there's no sexual frisson between the two, they're kind of grinding their attraction to each other is a bit like a tram on a grinding track or something. I've actually forgotten the exactly beautiful way he describes that, but it doesn't sound great. We begin to see a desperate woman's need to find some means of financial support, which is a big theme in this play, where there is none. We learn of her tragedy. At the heart of her tragedy is that her husband is discovered. She walks into a room and he's involved in a homosexual act. He's a homosexual. She doesn't like it. He puts a gun in his mouth and blows his brains out. That is at the core of Blanche's tragedy. That is Tennessee Williams' own story. Blanche's birthday comes around. Stanley's told Mitch all about Blanche's past, and Mitch, the only contender for marriage now, doesn't fancy her. Well, he fancies her, but he certainly doesn't want to marry her. And Stanley gives Blanche a one-way ticket back to where she came from. Stella goes off to have her baby. Mitch does call by, and Blanche suggests that they get married. They both need each other, but Mitch delivers this devastating insult: "You're not clean enough to bring home to my mother." Mitch wants sex, and now that he thinks that she's little more than a whore, but Blanche calls out, "Fire, fire." In the end, the penultimate scene, scene number 10, Stanley is in high spirits waiting for the baby. He's come home to have a little bit of a rest while Stella is pushing that baby out, and Blanche and he get involved in a first. It's quite pleasant between them. She smashes a bottle in self-defence, and Stanley overpowers her, carries her off, and we realise that he's raping her. In the final moments, Stella tells Eunice, "I couldn't believe her story and go on living with Stanley." And Eunice says, "Don't ever believe it. Life has got to go on." And Blanche is then committed to a mental asylum, and a doctor and nurse come to take her out.
Well, that is a terrific summary. Thanks a lot for it. I thought I'd ask you, as a playwright who has to go through this process of deciding what is in and out of a play, what do you think of that as a plot, which will, I guess, say a lot about whether you like the play, and what would he have gone through to create this thing? So did you say it was 12 scenes or 11 or 12? 11 scenes. How does he? Would there have been other scenes that are gone now? Would there have been performances that had scenes in it that are no longer exist? Can you talk a bit about being the writer of a play, and maybe give us a bit of an insight into what Tennessee Williams went through?
Well, I think that there's a lot of there's a huge amount of angst in this play, and I think that's sort of part of what makes it. The language itself is so powerful. And Arthur Miller says this great line when he says, with Streetcar, Tennessee had printed a licence to speak at full throat. And I must say, when I read it myself, I felt that permission too. I thought, God, when I get back to my desk, I'm going to actually, go for broke with the kind of passionate language because it's startling and certainly a page turn. I don't know about how you felt as you were reading it, but I found it quite, absolutely compelling. It was hard to put down. He would have honed and honed and honed that because every scene is absolutely packed. When you're writing a play, you're ticking off boxes of making sure that each scene develops your characters. We learn more about them. We're trying to move them, change them, make a turn in the centre of the scene so that our characters develop and we learn more about them. And they're also acting on story, so that the story's advancing over that each scene. But also thematically, it woven into every moment of that. Each of those scenes is his themes, and I think they're best understood really by the simple notions of class and gender. Some people talk about race in it, but I guess in a way Stanley Kowalski is a Pole, but he is the son of immigrant parents, so. That's really all we really learn about his Polishness. The Negroes in the play are not named. They're just Negroes. Everyone else has a name. So I don't think it really is an examination of race particularly, but I do think that it's about class. And from the minute that Blanche arrives, and she starts to be critical of everything, and she has that ludicrous affectation of walking through the poker game and saying, don't bother standing up, for me, as if those men were going to stand up for her anyway. And Stanley behaves in a very dismissive, blocking way. He never lubricates conversation with her. He never asks her a question. Well, he does ask questions, but they're very sort of they're questions that he has a way of blocking her answer. So you taught English, and she says yes, and he says I wasn't any good at it, and that just completely closes down the conversation as well. He's a man who doesn't like those kinds of pretensions, and he can also see that she's trying to undermine his marriage, and so he's going to be out to get her.
What do you think the class conclusion is? Is there a conclusion, or are we just meant to sort of think about the different backgrounds that people have and the immediate tension that creates, and it's just a dramatic device? Or is he trying to say something about class in 1948 or 49 in America that's a political statement?
I think he is, and I don't think that if he wasn't doing that the play would have had its kind of life and power. I think that he was absolutely engaging in both the politics of family and on writing about things that spoke to a much bigger national picture, as well as looking at the politics of the South. And I think what he was actually saying about class is that it's over. It's dead. That time of the sort of values of
innate superiority sort of thing.
Absolutely, that's a period that's finished, and now this new, tougher, harder life is what is the new world order. And get used to it, because there'll be people who fall off like moths. I mean, the first thing that he tells us when he sees Blanche arrive is that she's like a moth. So you think, what does that mean? I mean, it means a moth to the flame, but it also means a sort of delicate, fluttering creature that is, at the end, I think, that these, that this is not, that she's not robust enough.
And what about gender? I think I interrupted you when you were probably getting up to that. So, what do you think he's trying to bring out on the issues of gender?
Well, I mean, I think really that people. I mean, yes, Blanche does descend into madness, and I mean that was Tennessee Williams' own situation. He had dalliances himself with mental illness. And his sister was a schizophrenic, so he was no stranger to being in a mental. He had to go and be committed himself. So he knew about that. But to sort of dismiss Blanche as though it was kind of just mental illness is not to see that what was happening at the time is, it's best explained, I think, by looking at, I think it's scene 3 or scene 4, the morning after the night when Stanley has hit Stella. He's hit his wife, and Stella's luxuriating, saying, "Oh well, that's the way it is." And we know he's done it before, because Eunice has said that she'd called out, "We'll get the fire hose onto you like we did last time." So we know that this sort of violence and stuff is, has happened before. But there is Stella and Blanche in the room the next day, and both women. Stella is just, for her own survival, is going back to her husband. She has no choice. She's about to have a baby. She has no other means of financial support. There is Blanche starting to fabricate this thing about going off with the millionaire that she once dated, called Shep Huntley. And, you would say that these are delusions, but it is, she's grasping at straws too. And so both women, they've lost Belle Reeve, they've lost it through no fault of their own. Their powerlessness is very apparent in a totally brilliant speech that Blanche makes about her grandfather, her fathers, her uncles, all of them who've died at Belle Reeve and gone into the graveyard, and all of them have just whittled away gradually the estate that was their family's with their epic fornications. And they've lost that. So they don't have any traction for being able to support themselves, although she's a school teacher, so you have to take that into account. But, so I think that it shows us just how tough it was to be a woman then, how tough to be so reliant, I felt it very profoundly, that she was so reliant on the kindness of strangers, but on the which is so dependent on men. And Stanley Kowalski didn't really want to buy into that with her.
What about the language? I mean, it's a very striking first page. You start reading it and think, wow, this isn't really like a play. We had Richard III here 2 weeks ago, and we've had a couple of other plays, Cosy as well, and it really reads like a very, I'd use the word overwritten, I guess. It is beautiful, but to me it reads like an overwritten piece of thing. Can you give your views on the writing and how important it is to the play? Arthur Miller writes beautifully about it at the front as well, I know.
Well, I found the stage direction is quite fascinating, because certainly the modern way is to be very sparse and utilitarian, but I actually, just because I was so interested in the florid nature of his stage direction, so he says here at one point, "It is first dark of an evening early in May. The sky that shows around the dim white building is a peculiarly tender blue, almost turquoise, which invests the scene with a kind of lyricism and gracefully attenuates the atmosphere of decay. You can almost feel the warm breath of the brown river beyond the river warehouses with their faint redolence of bananas and coffee.
So he's got resonances and attenuates in the same paragraph of stage direction. That's a world record, isn't it?
But if you compare that, it's quite... if you compare that with The Tempest, William Shakespeare, he opens his first scene by saying, "A tempestuous noise of thunder and lightning heard, enter a shipmaster and a boatswain." That's the opening of The Tempest.
That's simple, to the point. Well, that's the modern tradition, really, is there in Shakespeare, isn't it? Where, and certainly in films and television, it's a real no-no, isn't it, to kind of be that far. Why has he done that, though? He must have done it deliberately, and he's regarded as a great, and this isn't even his first play. I mean, The Glass Menageries before this, so he's decided to do it this way. Why would he possibly have made that decision?
I think he was... he was really trying to evoke the South. He was keen to get on in Broadway, and he needed to be able to tell people what it was like. And my feeling is that, I think it actually... I'm going to adopt it from now on. I just think it's marvellous. It creates a very strong feeling of place, and why not? You know, most stage instructions, chair on the downstage left, and a staircase leads to table with a lamp on, and all that kind of stuff, which is just like directions for to the designer, really. But to actually creating this feeling of New Orleans, I think he loved New Orleans. I think he wanted to put the South on the map. And I also think it tells us a bit about Tennessee Williams as an outsider, and that basically all life is happening. I mean, you always feel this when even if you live in Koorie-Rupp and you come to Melbourne, you feel like all life is happening elsewhere. And I think if you were in the South and in the theatre, you felt that the only legitimate way of being in the theatre was to be on Broadway or be in New York. So there is a sort of sense of otherness. I was interested to read too that Arthur Miller talks beautifully about this play and about how when he saw it, he was just sort of totally mobilised to. Did I say that before about Willy Loman?
No, you haven't said that yet about how it was an inspiration for Death of a Salesman. Yeah,
and I sort of feel the same thing too, But the Willy Loman, Arthur Miller saw it, and he said, it wasn't the direction that impressed him. It wasn't necessarily the story or the characters particularly, although he did feel that that Tennessee Williams was a soulmate, and he was a very political person, and that what was so amazing was the language, and this is how he describes it. He says, there is a radical politics of the soul as well as the ballot box and the picket line. With Streetcar, Tennessee had printed a licence to speak at full throat. Elia Kazan said everything in his life is in his plays, and everything in his plays is in his life. But the memorable thing for me that Arthur Miller said is Streetcar is a cry of pain. Forgetting that is to forget the play. And to understand a bit about Tennessee Williams' life, that he had diphtheria as a child. He was poorly, so a lot of people actually, a lot of the American playwrights were sick as children and had immigrant parents, I note. His father thought he was a real Nancy boy and a sissy, and, he was actually really vilified by the kids and had to, and then became a homosexual, and that you can't be a public homosexual at that time. And so that was some of this, some of the language that comes from this is about, I think, absolutely coming from Tennessee Williams. Listen to this. Now, where are we? Page 47. This is when Blanche is talking about Stanley Kowalski, who is acting like something bestial. And think about this as a gay man who's being actually sort of vilified by the force of the majority. Keeping that in your head as you listen to this. So this is Blanche talking about Stanley. He acts like an animal, has an animal's habits. He eats like one, moves like one, talks like one. There's even something subhuman, something not quite to the stage of humanity yet. Yeah, something ape-like about him, like one of those pictures I've seen in anthropological studies. Thousands and thousands of years have pressed him right by, and there he is, Stanley Kowalski, survivor of the Stone Age, bearing the raw meat home from the kill in the jungle. And you, meaning Stella, you here waiting for him. Maybe he'll strike you, or maybe grunt and kiss you, that is, if kisses have been discovered yet. Night falls and the other apes gather, there in front of the cave, all grunting like him, and swilling and gnawing and hulking. His poker night, you call it, this party of apes. Somebody growls, some creature snatches at something. The fight is on. God, maybe we're a long way from being made in God's image. But Stella, my sister Stella, there has been some progress since then.
That's great. And the length of the speeches, it's interesting when you're writing for the theatre. I mean, not just in Streetcar, but when you write and when you read and see other plays, is there a license to go off? I know Shakespeare talks about soliloquy, I guess, but some of these speeches in Streetcar are just so long, like they're real. As you say, it's a cry of pain, or they're strange, I guess, to a modern ear. What's your reaction to it? Is it orthodox, or is this a strange play? And what's the overall effect?
Well, I think it's powerful. I don't think that modern writers write with the big soliloquy at all. Maybe they do a bit. When I think about Angels in America, Tony, whatever his name is, forgotten it temporarily, the writer of Angels in America, Kushner, he's done that. But I think, where there's certainly Australian playwrights, what we can learn from this actually is that there's a kind of timidity often in our writing that makes us worry about being being melodramatic, that making big, dramatic claims. I think that often happens when you write a big soliloquy like that. So you're just gilding the lily, laying it on too thick would be an Australian expression and concern for writers, and yet actually it's allowing people just to go with her hatred. I feel like that there's this loathing of Stanley is visceral at that point, and it's so marvellous,
It's interesting that Arthur Miller says how the play is dated because the natural tendency now is to pull everything back in a film or a television actor sort of way, and what made that play great in its debut run was that it was too big, and it was like it would. But yet people wouldn't play it like that now. That kind of big not overacting, but perfect acting style is out of style. And he thinks the recent productions that he saw at the end of his life were a bit insipid because the modern style has kind of poisoned it. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I often, when I'm casting and thinking, you've written something about you want to create a charismatic, powerful, strong man, and you think, where are the actors? Because no one would program any of this stuff unless they had the actor. So the first thing that you would think of if you're going to do Streetcar is, well, who's Blanche?
Yeah.
And if Kate Blanchett's there, and that they did it in Sydney with Kate Blanchett, well, you'd say, well, this is a vehicle for Kate. And that would be the first reason why theatre management would program it. But there is a sort of a sensibility that thinks things are a bit over the top, but somehow I just think the rawness of it is something that we can strive for, really, so that it's what's at stake that counts, and upping the ante is important sort of thing for all of us to do.
And actually over-the-top characters like Stanley and Blanche make an over-the-top play work, that because she is kind of a caricature, and she's aware of it, and so that you kind of get away with it in the play. Hey, we'll open up to questions. Who's going to be brave enough to ask the first question? There are no bad questions, and you can ask questions that you think are going to be on the exam at this point of the afternoon. Hands up. Oh, yes, at the back we've got a gentleman in a blue jumper.
In terms of reality, what do you think Streetcar's trying to say in terms of personal realities, personal biases, everything like that?
Is that the actual theme question? What is Streetcar trying to say in terms of personal biases and personal realities?
Well, I think my answer to that, and that's part of your contexts question, I think. Is it? No, it is. My simple sort of answer to that is that when I read the play, I was very aware of how sympathetic I felt to all of the people involved. That one of the skills, I think one of the great skills about the play is the empathy that it engenders in the audience member, the reader. That I knew why Stanley was so mad with her. She's an irritating cow at times. I knew why he wanted to thump her, and I felt for him that she was undermining his masculinity. It was his home, under his roof. It was his whiskey. We haven't talked about that at all. That she kept having endless nips of. Yeah. So I felt for him, and I knew that he was watching his wife kind of going over to the other side in some way. I also felt for her, this lost person who was desperate she was reaching out to that guy Mitch. She was fantasising about some fellow that she'd met years ago who was a millionaire oilman.
She's gone through tragedy, like just the worst sort of tragedy. Yeah.
So I think really when you talk about whose reality, the play is a great example of being able to switch from point of view to point of view and feel the difficulty of all of them in this situation. And I think that's ultimately, a really humanising thing. And one of the things that the theatre does really well is David Hare, who's a political playwright contemporary of mine, someone who's living now, he said, that's one of the great things about the theatre is that while a man is talking about fidelity to his wife, you see his hand move towards the bottom of his secretary and stick his hand on her bum, and you can see in that moment the sort of contradictions that exist within all of us, and the difference between what we say we are and what we do and all that kind of stuff. Well, the theatre does this thing of, allowing us to be and acknowledge our humanity.
Another question?
So we do see the idea of alcohol, and she drinks, and in a lot of plays and stories you get objects that mean certain things. Could we understand the alcoholism to be part of anything?
I think it's just alcohol. I think there are a lot of symbols through the whole thing. It's just rife with them, actually. So it's a good question. But I think it was just a function of, sort of a coping mechanism, and also a very big part of
the
Tennessee
mood
Williams.
swings. It probably explains the behaviour a bit, like the kind of the fantasism,
the violence,
the mood swings, the ups, the downs. Like she's got all that. But
so it's he. I mean, when he hits her, he's drunk too. But the other really great symbol is the whole stuff about the light, and that's really worth thinking about when you're writing, going through your through the text and having a look at the way she insists on having this lantern covering the light, and all that stuff about slightly what that does. That she doesn't really, she obfuscates the truth in the same way that she doesn't have, like what I've got now is this terrible naked bulb shining right at me. If I were Blanche, I would be putting something over that to make my complexion be in a better, softer light. But that metaphor for softening things, not looking too plainly, trying to evade the glare of truth, is a real key to Blanche, I think.
Another question? Is there one at the back there? I think yes.
Does the madness is the finale? Does the context explain the madness in any way, or should we read it as sort of a genetic predisposition?
It's a really great question, because that's what I was sort of trying to. I don't know, but I reckon that you could do a bob. It could be this, it could be that, a bob each way on that one, because in a way, just to say. I mean, I never write mad people in plays because it just sort of always feels a cop-out to me. It's like you then just say, oh, well, her circumstances, she got herself into the situation because she was mad and because she had schizophrenia.
You should, Hannie. The VCE syllabus people love it. We've got Cozzy and this one. So okay. Madness is right on this year in 2011.
Yeah, well, I suppose actually mental illness is a big topic. I don't mean to be glib about that, but I don't want you to be able to, or one to be able to dismiss the actual true, real external forces that are acting on these women that make them powerless, and their powerlessness is actually a central theme of the play. They're stuck.
Yeah. So no, I wasn't. I was just trying to think. Did you ask whether it was to be taken as kind of literal madness? Like, is there an answer in terms of whether she was mad at the end? Do you think that's sort of what we're getting at?
I think she was. I mean, they went to she was taken away to an asylum, but. I suppose rather than saying that her madness was genetically, she was predisposed to that, rather than looking at the actual forces that came to play that sent a woman, to this state, drinking too much. I don't know, whether all that stuff.
Can we say that loneliness is a theme?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, there was someone that I was reading was pairing loneliness as the opposite side of desire, and I think loneliness is such a sort of modern state and such a poignant state. Write well about loneliness and thinking about, when those two women, Blanche and Stella, first meet, the kind of joy of connection of two sisters who've been separated, and I felt for them in that moment. I thought, this is wonderful. They are actually, they're connected, and then I thought about her, going off trying to find some happiness with that guy Mitch, and it just seemed a disaster. And I think loneliness is a strong theme, but I think you need to, when you're talking about theme, is to always pair it with something else. Pair it with a kind of contradiction or a conflict, and to think about desire and where that's and I said we'd talk about that stuff in the bedroom. That I knew you'd go quiet then. That what is it about Stella, and what is it that Stella and Stanley have that would couldn't be broken, and their sort of sexual physical relationship is. Is very strongly portrayed in the play. So I think those things are worth thinking about: loneliness and desire.
Well, A Streetcar Named Desire, I think one of the most beautiful titles, if nothing else. It's such a great title, and a great play. I loved reading it over the last couple of days. I've also loved having Hannie along with us today. Hannie Rayson, please put your hands together for her.